This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Faithful podcast listeners, it's time to confront those dreaded three little words: back to school. We're going to make it as painless as possible and give you some great story ideas for the K-12 beat. Here to help me is Kate Grossman. She's the education editor for WBEZ in Chicago. She's been a reporter for nearly 2 decades. Most recently, she was deputy editorial page editor at the Chicago Sun-Times. She wrote about education and state policy, among other topics. Kate, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
I always love to hear what desk editors are thinking about and talking about with their reporters. There's no shortage of great story ideas coming out of the Windy City, and you've brought a few of them with you. What's at the top of your list?
Well, we always like to do kind of a mix of sort of big idea, agenda setting stories for back to school, and then the sort of more pedestrian, what's new this year. And I hope people don't dismiss those, because I think those have a lot of value for parents and also for reporters to understand what's happening in their school district and what they want to follow during the year. But on the big picture stuff, we are looking at changing student demographics, and specifically the fact that student demographics, particularly in the suburbs, are changing, but teacher demographics are not, meaning student population is becoming less white, but the teacher population is remaining white. So we've been looking at a school out in the suburbs that's grappling with that.
So just to clarify, this is something that's spreading outside of the city of Chicago to the wider neighborhoods. Why is that happening?
In Chicago, and I think this is a national phenomenon, families of color and low-income families are leaving the cities in some significant numbers for a lot of reasons, for housing and for schools. And so we're seeing some of the same populations we used to live in the city of Chicago, now living in some of the inner ring and some of the outer ring suburbs too. And as a result, their student populations that used to be primarily white, not low income, and then you're getting this big change. And these are school districts that are just completely not prepared for it. They're not prepared in the sense that they have a teaching population that remains predominantly white. And this is definitely a national phenomenon. Teacher population is static at white, but the student population is becoming more diverse.
When we talk about being prepared or not prepared, I mean, really part of this is about cultural competency. When we talk about teachers being prepared to teach students who may not look like them or may have grown up in very different environments from what the teacher has experienced.
Exactly. And that's what the school district that we're focused on for our back to school story is grappling with. They're slowly, very slowly trying to change their teacher population. But in the meantime, and in addition, they're also trying to be culturally responsive, which is one of the new buzzwords in education, to their students. And so they've done a complete overhaul of their curriculum to try to make it less about compliance and more about making sure that they're understanding that their kids are getting it. They're trying to have a lot of difficult conversations with a white teacher population about cultural differences with students. Like, for example, if you have in the Black culture or some Black parts of the Black culture, it's much more sort of a call and response out of the Black church, where kids might talk back to the teacher, but that's kind of normal in some cultures, but teachers might be surprised by that or find that somehow disrespectful. But helping teachers understand culturally where kids are coming from. Also, a funny anecdote was one guy who does training on this just talked about discouraging teachers from kind of acting down with their kids, using language like lit and stuff to sound like they're somehow connecting with their kids, which I think is an instinct that all adults do, but usually doesn't help connect with kids.
I think that's a fantastic story idea. And I would encourage our reporter listeners, if you're planning to write about this, to keep in mind the research that's out there on the value of a diverse teacher workforce. It's not just for the students of color, but also for white students benefit from being in more diverse classrooms. And that includes having the opportunity to be taught by a teacher who doesn't look like them.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely part of our story too, because some people might not appreciate why this matters or might have never thought about it. So that context is really important.
You also wanted to share an idea that's based off a radio series that WBEZ has been doing for the past few years. It was actually launched by the Teacher Project out of Columbia University, and that's What My Students Taught Me. Tell us about that.
This is a series of stories we did for back to school last fall, which I just loved. The idea is really simple. You find one teacher who had some sort of really meaningful experience with a student, and that teacher talks about what they learned from their student. And if possible, in several of the stories, we also interviewed the student about their perspective on that kind of learning that their teacher did. And I mean, particularly for radio, that this certainly can work for print too. They're just incredibly powerful human stories about this really intimate relationship between what can be a really intimate relationship between a teacher and a student. And I loved doing it last year because you sort of get caught up in the budget and the social problems and all the like really important stuff that we need to cover in education, but you forget about like really at its core, education is about these human connections. And so we did a series of 4 interviews with teachers and some of their student, a single student last year to kick off back to school, which I just thought was we got such a positive response from listeners to, these are sort of these classic driveway moment radio stories where people love hearing about these intimate relationships, and it's something that certainly everybody can relate to.
I have to say, one of my favorite series that WBEZ does is the end of the year when you ask students in different grade levels to share a piece of knowledge that they've acquired. And I'm wondering if there's a way to flip that around for the start of the year and for folks to ask kids and maybe even parents what they're hoping to get out of the year that's coming.
A great idea. I love that. This notion of really just checking in with kids. We do a lot of stories in general in education coverage that don't talk to kids or that are really policy oriented. And any opportunity there is to hear what kids' aspirations are or what they learned, I think is a great idea. So I'm going to go ahead and steal that.
Okay, go ahead, do it. You also have a story idea that's a little more specific for states that allow tax credit scholarships. Let's discuss that one.
So we did last year. Illinois was in its first year of having a tax credit scholarship, which is basically a kind of voucher. Like the opponents don't like to say that, but it's essentially a kind of voucher. And we really wanted to look at the data, like how many kids are getting it, where are they coming from, how many kids are low income, what kind of schools are they going to? Were they already in private school or were they new to private school? And so Linda Lutton, who did this reporting, went out and collected all this data. It was not readily available from the state. So this was really sort of classic shoe leather reporting where she had to call a million different scholarship granting organizations. And what we presented to the public, I think, was really instructive. And you could do this if your state is starting a tax credit scholarship program or if it's 5 years old. And we were the 18th state, so it's a lot of states. It's available in a lot of states to really look at these hard questions about what sort of the aspirations of these kind of programs and then what are they delivering. And we broke some news when we did this data reporting, which, for example, showing that almost a third of the kids who were benefiting were not actually low income, which is one of the aspirations of the program was to try to reach as many low income students as possible. We showed, how Illinois its program fit in nationally. It turns out Illinois had one of the biggest programs, both in terms of the dollar amounts and in terms of the tax credit. It's a 75% tax credit. And so we did one story that kind of broke some news around what's unique and what's with the data. And then we did a separate story just going to a school that was really benefiting. They had 30 kids on these kind of scholarships and hearing from the parents' side, because of course, from these families, it's huge difference in their lives to be able to not have to pay for private school. In this case, it was a Catholic school education. And so we really tried to show what it meant for these families and for this school, as a lot of Catholic schools, at least in Chicago, are struggling financially. And so really made a huge difference for that particular school.
I'd say that looking at tax credit scholarships is a great story idea, even if you may not be in a state that's offering it right now, because it is on the U.S. Supreme Court's docket for October. They're going to be hearing a case out of Montana, which overturned a tax credit scholarship program on the rule that it violated the separation of church and state. So certainly this is going to be a hot button issue nationally. So I'm going to put on my public editor hat for a moment and just remind reporters that if you are going to write about this, be sure to explain to your listeners how tax credit scholarship programs differ from vouchers. Vouchers typically mean that existing school funding will follow a student to the school of his or her choice. And a tax credit scholarship program is a way to try to create usually a new kind of revenue stream, either by incentivizing businesses to donate a portion of their tax income to a separate fund that will pay for these scholarships. We're talking with Kate Grossman of WBEZ Chicago about her back to school story ideas. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. We're also going to be talking about some higher education story ideas, so be sure to check your podcast queue for that upcoming episode. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. Kate, I have a couple of story ideas, and one of them actually came from a piece that I saw on WBEZ, and that is this idea of sanctuary cities spreading to school districts and individual campuses. That idea has gained ground in the past couple of years with the Trump administration ramping up the use of ICE raids in communities, and it's under discussion in Chicago. What's up with the union?
So Chicago Teachers Union and the Chicago Board of Education are in the midst of contract talks. And one of the many issues that have come up is this idea of designating sanctuary schools. And the question we looked at was like, what the heck does that mean? So beyond this obvious point of wanting the school district not to allow immigration officials into schools without a warrant and not cooperating. That's sort of the baseline. That's what the union has been asking for. And actually, we have a bunch of charter unions in Chicago, and over the past year, several of them had strikes, and they got that language codified in their contract that their charter managers will not let immigration officials come into the school. Chicago Public Schools has committed to that, so there's less pressure around the idea of codifying that in the contract. But the teachers union has broadened this to mean they want schools to be a haven for families who are just immigrating and help them acclimate to their new culture. So, for example, we looked at a school in Chicago where a bilingual coordinator has just taken on this role on his own because the need was so prevalent. We told the story about a mom who'd showed up. She had an ankle monitor because she had been detained at the border. She arrived with her kids. They had no place to live. They had no winter coats. They needed legal assistance. And so this bilingual coordinator created something that I think is the sort of essence of this idea of a sanctuary school where immigrants can come and find the help that they need to acclimate to the new culture.
One idea for reporters looking at the concept of sanctuary schools is the NEA's Safe Zones resolution. It's been adopted by more than 100 school districts across the country. It essentially restates a commitment to the tenets of the Plyler versus Doe Supreme Court decision. That's the one that determined that students are entitled to a free public education regardless of their immigration status. That is the law of the land. Now, I thought it was interesting because this Safe Zones template that the NEA puts online, it's an open access document that can be used in whole or in part by individual school boards to craft their own resolutions, and they don't have to give credit back to the NEA.
Well, this is an issue, across the country, obviously with the Trump administration and its approach towards immigrants. But in Chicago, for example, we've seen the student population change very dramatically over the last 10 years. It used to be a majority Black school district, and now it's almost the Hispanic population is now outnumbers the Black population, and it's reaching almost, I think it's at 49, it's almost at a majority. So these issues, and we're certainly not the only school district, these issues are rising in public interest as the school district is changing.
On a somewhat related story, it's probably a good time to ask civics and history teachers if they're rethinking any of their lesson plans and how they may be thinking about talking about current events like migrant detention centers, a rise in white supremacist activities, and reports nationally of increases in things like hate speech and racial bullying.
Yeah, and that's reporters also need to be really, really be careful when they're looking at those stories and be critical. Teachers are not supposed to espouse their personal opinions in the classroom. for good reason, right? They're supposed to be sort of neutral arbiters. And so it's important I think it's a good story to look at, like, how are teachers presenting this information? You want to be sympathetic, dealing with oftentimes student populations that are immigrants themselves. And so, of course, you want to be sympathetic, but you don't want to be sort of proselytizing in the classroom. So I think that's a good story to look at, like, how do teachers, if you can get yourself in a classroom and see, or in multiple classrooms and see how teachers are presenting information, whether they're making an effort to be impartial.
Absolutely. A big piece of that story is how teachers are going to walk what can be a very fine line. For reporters who are looking for examples of some of this reporting to inspire you, take a look at Education Week and ProPublica's project on documenting hate, and also the Southern Poverty Law Center Teaching Tolerance program has some good questions to ask of teachers in the classroom on how they can sort of balance those dual responsibilities, which Kate just laid out so beautifully there. I got to ask, is there a favorite back to school story you've gotten to tell?
I really had to rack my brain to think about that. Like I said before, I think there's two kinds of back to school stories. There's sort of the big picture where you're trying to set the agenda for the school year, and that's some of the things that I just mentioned. And then there are also sort of the more run-of-the-mill, what's new this school year story. And I really want to encourage people not to look down their nose at those kind of stories, because I think that they serve two really important purposes. One, I think they're a real public service to parents and taxpayers and the community, if you explain what is new this school year. Of course, including, you're not just going to take the agenda from the school board and put out a press release. You're going to include your own information, things that they're not going to want to talk about. So I think it serves a really important public service. And I also think it is really helpful for a reporter to get your mind oriented on really what is new this year. What are the big issues to watch this school year? Because it helps you set your agenda for the year to think about what you want to follow up on. And say, for Chicago, for example, is doing a major curriculum overhaul, really for the first time, to have a uniform curriculum across the school district. Sounds great. We know in practice it's going to be a ton of problems. So laying that out now and knowing before school starts as much as we possibly can about what the aspirations are will allow us to, follow it properly when school begins. But in terms of my sort of big picture, my favorite was a story I did for The Atlantic looking at second chances for students. This was based on looking at the freshman on track rate, which is looking basically at whether students are passing freshman year, because if you pass freshman year, that's a very strong indicator of whether you're actually going to graduate. So I started looking at that, but then it kind of turned into this whole story about this movement to give kids lots and lots of extra chances, which makes a lot of sense, but it can really go overboard and end up diluting what a diploma means. And so this basic question about, if we want kids to graduate so badly, are we watering down the curriculum so much that maybe it doesn't mean very much? To me, that was a great big picture back to school story that can help sort of get people talking about something different than what the Board of Ed wants to be talking about, but really thinking about big, deep issues that are percolating under the surface, but maybe no one has kind of put a name on it.
I just think it's a great reminder that everything old is new again. And even if it's your 10th or umpteenth back to school, it's somebody's first back to school. And the kinds of things they're going to be looking for from your media outlet are information about signing up for the bus, free and reduced lunch, and all of the basics. And those things have to be covered.
Yeah, for sure. I've been doing this for 20 years. And so you do get a little tired of things, but right, there's always a new round of kindergarten parents starting out and they need information. And even parents that have been around a long time think they know everything. It's our job to really step back and try to put a bunch of pieces together and connect things that they see at their school with things that are happening at lots of schools and nationally.
Okay, well, let's jump in the time machine for a second and go back to your very first back to school. What do you wish you knew then? What are some reminders for folks who may be venturing out for the first time this fall?
Don't try to interview for print, in particular, really young kids. It will not yield. Sometimes it works really beautifully for radio and for TV. For print, it's not a good use of your time. I guess I would say, I think in the beginning of my career, I was very focused on sort of the policy process kind of stories. And I've learned over time, for God's sakes, always put like a person at the center of your story. Make them as human as possible, your stories. And this is not so much for summer, but always carry a pencil. Sometimes your pen's going to run out, or if it's really cold, your pen will freeze, and you got to always have a pencil. And always a notebook in your bag, no matter what.
I would add to that backup batteries for your digital recorder.
Yes.
And take as many business cards as your bag can hold. Hand them out to everybody. School custodians, campus resource officers, teachers, administrators. You're not going to talk to everybody that day, but they may need to call you and they'll have your business card handy. And also, collect as many names and phone numbers for teachers in as many different grades as you can while you're on site, because those are the cell phones you're going to want to tap when something else comes up and you're looking for voices.
Yeah, excellent. Good advice.
Kate, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate you making time for the EWA Radio podcast. I hope it's a fantastic back to school for you and the entire award-winning team at WBEZ.
Thanks, Emily, and all the great work you guys do at EWA. We really appreciate it.
Kate Grossman is the education editor for WBEZ and joined us from her office in Chicago. That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line, woodраdio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.